He didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until his cabinet doors started opening up by themselves. And the growling he heard under his bed? Yeah, it wasn't his dog. This is a story of what happened in a cheap basement apartment in Ohio, just a couple of minutes down the road from one of the most haunted places in America. If you're into creepy true stories, then go ahead and hit that like button right now. And make sure you hit subscribe to hear more tales to keep you up at night. Mark was a factory worker living in Columbus, Ohio. In his 20s, he had gotten into a lot of trouble, but eventually he settled down into a quieter life, living with his mother and his dog Fred. But things really turned around when he met Debbie, a bartender with sharp wit and a big heart. They hit it off fast, eventually getting married, and they were ready to start their life together. But there was just one problem. Debbie did not want to live with Mark's mother. She wanted them to have their own place. So they searched the classified ads and found what looked like a great deal. A basement apartment in a house just a few blocks away from Mark's job. The rent was absurdly low. In fact, suspiciously low. But the space was big, the location was perfect, and Mark figured, someone must have just moved out recently. The house was owned by an old woman who still lived upstairs. She explained that she had converted the basement into a separate unit about 10 years earlier after her knees gave out and she could no longer make it up and down the stairs and she needed a little bit of extra money to help out. Mark asked her, well, why is the rent so low? And she said she had been dropping it over and over because she couldn't seem to keep the renters longer than a few months. Debbie and Mark looked at each other simultaneously, shrugged, smiling with excitement at the prospect of a great deal. They both said, we'll take it. The old woman's eyes lingering a little bit too long at the basement door, but she smiled and handed them the keys. The house itself sat on a small hill, partially hidden behind overgrown trees. The front porch sagged just slightly in the middle, and the windows upstairs were almost always dark. It had that old, heavy feel. Even in broad daylight, it gave off a quiet unease, but they were broke, and the price was right. The apartment was just minutes away from the factory where Mark worked. Convenient. But it was also dangerously close to something else. The site of old Ohio State Penitentiary, a place where hundreds of prisoners had died in a fire. Locals say that the land was cursed long before the fire. But after that night, it became something else. A graveyard with no headstones, just heat and screams. The basement unit was cold, dark, and a little depressing, but Mark was handy, and Debbie had a good eye for decorating. They fixed it up, they moved their furniture in, and they set up a special spot just for their dog Fred right near the front door. The place still had a weird energy though, but they just chalked it up to being in a basement living underground. But one night, all of that would change. Mark came home late from work one night and Debbie was already asleep, but she left his favorite meatloaf dinner wrapped up in tinfoil. Excitedly, Mark cracked open a beer, turned on the TV, and began to unwrap his dinner. As he chomped down, he heard a sharp noise from further into the house. It sounded like a clink or a tap. Something weird and out of place. At first, he thought it was just Debbie and he called out her name. But as he listened, he could hear her snoring loudly, already fast asleep in their bedroom. Curiously, he stepped into the long, dark hallway with the bedroom on the far end and the bathroom just around the corner. Inside, the light was on, the door half open. A light tingle rushed up his spine as he reached out and pushed open the bathroom door with his palm. But there was nothing there. It was empty. But just as he was about to leave, that's when he saw it. One of Debbie's makeup containers, cylindrical in shape, slowly rolling across the floor. Not tipped, not dropped, just moving. It wobbled once and then it stopped. It was weird, but not ghost weird. Not yet. People in Columbus always blame stuff on ghosts, especially around here, close to where the old prison used to be. In joking fashion like, That's a ghost, and that's a ghost, and that's a ghost. Mark figured it was just the building being old or settling. Maybe it fell off the counter. Maybe Debbie placed it too close to the edge. Mark didn't really give it that much thought, just whatever. He went back, turning his attention back to the TV, and that's when Fred began to growl, a low, throaty rumble from the other room. Then the cabinet in the kitchen slowly started to creak open. He turned just in time to see a glass cup falling, bounce off the counter, and shatter on the floor. The makeup was one thing, but this was not normal. Putting an object close to the edge of a table and it falling? Okay. But a cabinet door opening? No. Then the smell hit him. A thick, putrid, like rotting meat left in the heat type of smell. But different and worse. There was a sting in his throat like sulfur, rancid, like something scorched. He gagged. For just a flicker of a second, he saw flames, screaming, skin burning. But it wasn't a memory. Not his, at least. It felt like someone else's memory, shoved into his head. His dog Fred, however, was still fixated on the kitchen where the glass had broken, growling. "Fred! Fred, come here!" he yelled. But he couldn't tear Fred's attention away from the kitchen. Mark, like most men, decided to just shrug it off, and he cleaned up the glass and decided not to tell Debbie about it. She's scared easily, and he didn't want to make the situation worse. And the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that maybe it just was his imagination. He was working too hard. A few days passed. Saturday came, which meant football. Mark invited a buddy over to watch the game, while Debbie took the opportunity to run to the grocery store. After a few beers and the home team win, his friend left and Mark passed out on the couch. Sometime later, he was jolted awake by Fred barking like an absolute maniac in the bedroom. Grumbling, Mark got up. He found Fred on the top of the bed, barking at the ceiling, then at the mattress below his feet. The growl wasn't just a noise, though. It was focused, directed, like Fred could see something that Mark couldn't. Then the smell hit him again. Burned rot. He grabbed Fred by the collar and tried to pull him out of the room, but Fred whined and resisted, and he was fixated on something in the room, and he just didn't want to leave. But once Mark pulled him far enough out of the bedroom, he turned and sprinted into the living room. Mark, now alone in the hallway, standing there confused. He heard a deep growling sound, but behind him from inside of the bedroom. It was lower and deeper than any sound Fred could make, and he just watched Fred go into the other room in the opposite direction. In a shaky voice, he called out, "Who's there?" He turned, standing at the edge of his bedroom, reluctantly reached in and flipped on the light. Cautiously, he entered the room. Nothing. He checked the closet. Nothing. He knelt down, lifted the bed skirt, and peered under the bed. But there was nothing there. Then, as he stood up, a black shadow darted across the room. Fast, human shape, gone in the blink of an eye. He froze. A tingle of fear and alertness shot up his spine. Did I just see what I think I saw? Was that my shadow I just saw? Possibly a trick of the light? But when he turned, he could see his own shadow, right where you could expect it to be. He called out to Fred, and Fred came trotting back in the bedroom like nothing had happened, like he didn't even remember what was going on, and he had already forgot. Fred's oblivious calm brought Mark back to life. The fear didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. Mark grabbed his keys, walked out the front door, slamming it shut behind him. The situation with their apartment was getting worse, but they couldn't afford to leave. Not yet. So they stayed. But it didn't really feel like home anymore. Mark wanted to protect his wife and give her the life that he had promised her. But he didn't know how to fight something like this. He felt trapped, like we're buried in an underground tomb with no way out. And whatever was down there with him, it did not want company. That night over dinner, Mark casually asked Debbie, "You notice anything weird going on in the apartment lately?" She hesitated and said, "Sometimes it smells like something died in the walls, and I keep hearing footsteps upstairs at night. Light ones, fast ones, like someone's running around." Mark put his fork down. Debbie raised an eyebrow, and she knew by the look on his face that something was really wrong. Then he began to explain things that he was experiencing, at least some of it. The broken glass, the smell, but he left out the shadow and the growling. He told himself it was to protect her, but really, he didn't want to admit it out loud. Over the next couple of weeks, things got even worse. There were more noises, more growling, more footsteps late at night. The worst part was trying to sleep. Mark described it like this. You lay there, half asleep, trying not to breathe too loud, and you know something is in the room, watching you, waiting, like it wants you to hear it. It wants you to know it's there. Imagine that. You can't sleep, so the sleep deprivation affects everything in your life, and you don't even feel safe in your own home. One night, Debbie brought something up. You ever notice how she, pointing to the lady upstairs, walks around up there? It's like 5 steps, pause, 5 steps, the same thing every time. Mark had noticed, and it wasn't random creaking. It was like a pattern. It didn't sound like the old woman with the cane would be walking around barely moving. It sounded like not the old woman, like there was something else up there. When they casually asked the old woman about it, she assured them that there was no one else living up there. It was just her. No guests in the house, nobody else. But she paused just a second too long before answering. And the smile she gave afterwards, it just felt off. Like she had been caught in a lie, but she didn't care. And on top of that, half of the time they heard the footsteps way past midnight at weird hours when the house was quiet. The final straw came late one night. Mark was lying in his bed, staring at the ceiling, and the room was cold, like really cold. Fred came trotting in like usual. He always does, and he laid at the foot of the bed. Just as Mark started to drift off, though, Fred began to growl again. But it didn't sound like Fred. It sounded deeper, like an imitated growling. Like something or someone trying to mimic the sound of a dog. And it came from directly underneath the bed. Mark bolted upright, yelled in the manliest voice that he could muster, flipped on the light. Fred stared at him confused. Mark grabbed his baseball bat, ready. He crouched down, reached out, and quickly yanked up the bed skirt and peered underneath. But nothing. No one. But he knew, whatever it was, it did not want them there. So, like any normal person, he finally decided, that's it, I've had enough. And 2 days later, they moved out and moved back in with his mother. And Mark never looked back. But every once in a while, out of pure curiosity, Mark likes to drive by that old lot. Now, the house is torn down, and now it's just an empty lot with overgrown grass. Now, Mark has 2 theories. One, someone died down there. A relative, maybe the old lady's husband. Maybe the old woman just never said anything, because what type of renters are going to want to live in a place where someone died? But that would mean it's haunted. Theory number 2 is that land never stood a chance, because it's just down the road where old Ohio State Penitentiary used to be. where hundreds of people burned to death in a fire, on top of the natural, insane violence that giant prisons like that already have. Some people say that the screams never really stopped. Mark doesn't really know, which story is true. He just knows that the house is gone, and whatever lived underneath that bed was not human. If you made it this far, I just want you to know that I really appreciate you being here, and we would be nothing without you guys, the viewers, so thank you very much. You can further help us by hitting that like button right now, so go ahead and hit that like button, or I'm gonna tell Mom. If you have a creepy story suggestion, go ahead and drop it in the comments, or just tell me what you think about this video right here, or a possible paranormal experience that you yourself have had. I just really would love to hear about it. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and make sure you check under your bed tonight. Goodbye for now, and sleep tight. Unless you live in Ohio, because it's haunted all over there. Peace.